welcome all, both our local visitors and the people from residency, to the hot part of the year. This is not as hot as it gets. We're still about 10 degrees or 15 degrees below that, but welcome everyone. Let me set the context for the theoretical foundation a little bit, and that is, you're all familiar with the 10 strategic points, which kind of provides the overall framework for your research. It's both a vision for your research and an architecture. And if you haven't seen the presentation, there is a presentation on the website where the rest of these are that goes through what it is kind of step by step. Well, what we've been doing in this past year is taking a lot of those primary steps and really diving in and taking a look at them. So you'll find some things on the 10 core designs and what are the quantitative and qualitative designs you can use for your research. There's a presentation in there. And then that's broken up to a presentation on some qualitative designs and some quantitative designs. And then the last presentation for those of, how many of you were here for the last presentation I did on defining the gap? Okay. So there's the one on defining the gap, which is a way of looking at and defining the need for your study. And the thing about defining the gap is, you know that word gap, exit out. You're not defining a gap, you're not defining a void, you're defining a need, okay? And so if you haven't thought about how you're going to define that need, that presentation gives you 4 or 5 ways to define the need that justifies your study. And that's one of the things you have to do, because it has to be clearly defined, and you have to put together some logical arguments to prove it. Once you've done that, you're ready to go find the models and theories that are going to support you. And you'll find that when I go into the presentation, we're giving you one way to do a theoretical foundation. You'll find all different researchers, all different universities, all different schools do it differently. Research isn't cookie cutter. There are many ways to do it, but we want to give you a structured and focused way, since the program here at GCU, with you going through in 3 to 4 years to complete your doctorate, which is half the time that most people take, is that you have to be able to do things more efficiently and effectively. And so that's one of the reasons we have all these models put together. So I'm going to go through, assume you find the gap or your need. And you, out of that gap or need, you have defined your problem statement. That's what your whole research is going to focus on. Like, it's not known if there's a relationship in principles between emotional intelligence and the quality of the environment. Or you're trying to understand a phenomenon of why do high-performing leaders show high levels of emotional IQ. You've got to have that done before you go find your theories that you're going to use to support that research. So I just mentioned emotional intelligence, right? So emotional intelligence is actually a model or theory. And finding theoretical foundations is finding your models and theories that you are going to use to develop your research questions. That's all it's about. You start with your problem statement, you go explore and find those models and theories, and then you're going to use them to develop what are your research questions in quantitative, and then ultimately you define your variables and hypotheses in quantitative. And we're going to be talking about the process of how to do that. So I'm going to go through quickly through an agenda that says, defines what a theoretical foundation is, looks at the different ways that you can find models and theories. I'm going to go through some dissertations, and I'm going to talk to you about how you actually use those models and theories to develop your research questions. So in terms of the theoretical foundation, you'll often see the words theoretical foundation and conceptual framework used. And some people use interchangeably. And there is no, go into the literature, there's no clear definition of theoretical foundation, theoretical framework, and conceptual framework. And so what we have done is tried to give a definition of those that we could use. Within the dissertation, you'll see the section in Chapter 2 is called Theoretical Foundations. And it is basically the models and theories that provide the foundation for your research. and that you use to develop your research questions or variables and hypotheses, and then how you're going to collect your data. The conceptual framework often goes beyond that, and it talks about all the different concepts and models and theories that are related to your dissertation, and we don't ask you to do that. We really want you to stay focused on those primary models and theories, or models, the areas of those models and theories that you're actually going to use, and we want you to talk about how you're going to use them. So we don't expect you to go into an in-depth conceptual framework that goes beyond that. Next slide. And you'll find that it's actually in Chapter 2. Chapter 2 is your literature review, right? And the literature review section starts with an introduction where you say, high level, here's what I'm doing my research on. Here's how I found my literature. Then you define the background to the problem. That's where you define the need for your research. You use the literature. It could be, as we talked about in the last presentation, the need can be driven by high areas of research. So there's a lot of research on the relationship between leadership theories and organizational climate and performance. So you can say, here's a broad area of research. There's 50 studies. This looked at this model, this area of organization, and this area of performance. But there's a new model out on spiritual leadership, so it makes sense that there's a new model out that we may want to look at it. Or there's a new context that we want to look at it in terms of particular type of organizations. So you justify it based on a broad area of research. You justify it based on what other authors have suggested needs to be researched. And with a lot of good set of arguments, you put together a few set of arguments supported by the literature to define the need for your research. And saying there's a gap and no research has been done in an area is not justification for doing the research. That's why we say X the gap word. And what you're looking for is a defined need. And it can come out of a societal need plus the literature. It can come out of previous research plus the literature. It can come out of synthesizing different topics together plus the literature. Or it can come out of reframing the problem. And once you've done that, in that section, in the background to the gap section, or the background to the problem, you end up with a problem statement. So your problem statement should come out of that defined need. It does not, and for any of you who have had me in residency, you may not pull anything out of your head when you're doing the dissertation. You close your head and you open up the literature, and everything has to come out of the literature. Now you have to use your head to synthesize it and to use it, but you can't just pull things out of your head. And you can't pull your theoretical foundation model out of your head either. So the easiest way to find it is to look at those studies based on the problem statement. So if I'm looking at emotional intelligence and organization commitment, I go look for a whole bunch of empirical articles on emotional intelligence, organization commitment, and I start looking for my models and theories, and I would start filing them, keeping them all, and putting together that group of models and theories that are relevant to my topics, because there's a lot. There's lots of theories on emotional intelligence. There's lots of theories on organization commitment. There's lots of versions of engagement, satisfaction, climate that are all related. Okay? And you can use that to build a section. And so you'll see here the rubric that's in that section. It defines what you need to have in a section. Here's a key bit of wisdom. If you want to save an extra course, when you write your dissertation deliverables, whether it be the prospectus, the proposal, or the dissertation, you write to the rubrics. Now, how many of you had instructors that didn't always use the grading rubrics in your regular classes? A lot, right? Because they're used to different degrees. However, in the dissertation, that is not true. Everybody uses the rubrics. Your chair will use them, your committee will use them, and you will not get AQR approval unless you meet them. So write to them. And this kind of talks about the rubric that you need for your theoretical foundation section. You need to put together a logical set of arguments to justify the models and theories. You talk about how those models and theories have been used before. You relate them to the problem statement, and then you use them to define your research questions on qualitative, and then go beyond that to define the variables and hypotheses for the quantitative, okay? So always write to the rubrics. If you don't the first time, you will, whether it be the second time or the 10th time. So it's much easier to do it at the first time. In terms of scoring, and let me raise something about the nature of scoring and grades. When you get into your dissertation classes and you have obnoxious chairs like me, one of the things we do is the game has changed. You're now becoming a doctor, right? You're not doing what you did for your master's degree. Well, you have built some of the skills, if you've really practiced on your writing and read a lot of the articles and done a lot of the analysis, you've built some of the skills. But in the doctoral dissertation classes, you're going to build more. And when you do a dissertation, most of you haven't done a dissertation, and it's very different than a paper. So when you start seeing the scoring in the rubrics, you will notice that in dissertation classes, you will not all get A's. It just won't happen. I haven't had a dissertation class where everybody got A's. Because what an A says is the section is perfectly well written. That's very, very well written. And you have fully met all the criteria. And that's not likely to happen. So you'll find that there's a scoring thing in all the rubrics and dissertations and in AQR, where 3 is like exceptional. That means just about the quality that you see in empirical articles or very well-written dissertations, and every single criteria and condition is met. So mostly when you begin to get feedback from your chairs, you're going to be getting 0s and 1s and maybe 1.5, because a dissertation is something that evolves. There's a lot of concepts, and it's not easy. And the theoretical foundation section is one of the harder sections to put together. Okay? So just don't expect it, and don't panic when you see 1s and 2s, because actually the 2 in the dissertation work means it's approved and ready to go to the next step. Okay? So next slide. In terms of, I'm going to have to get up for a minute. In terms of some of the building blocks, you'll see the concepts of laws, theories, models, and concepts. Let me talk about that. In the EDD program, you'll see mostly models and theories. So you'll find a change model, or you'll find such and such as theory. In psychology, on the other hand, there are a whole series of laws. And you can actually find some psychology books on theories, and it'll say models, theories, and laws. So, however, mostly in the education side, you won't see laws. Most of your theoretical foundations, in fact, all of them, are either going to be a law, a theory, a model, or if you can't find a law, a theory, or model, a broad concept. So a theory is a well-stated, our law is well-stated, it's been proven over and over and over again. Theories are generally proven, researched, been researched a number of times, and it ends up evolving from just a simple model into a theory. The other way the term model is used, when you read the theories, and even when you read the laws, often there's a visual presentation of it. That visual presentation is the model. That model becomes very important in your theoretical foundation. You don't want to just know that, let's say Kotter has 7 steps for change management. You want to know what they are. Because let's say you were looking at how a school effectively used change management practices to move to Common Core or to become an excelling school. You have to know all those steps. So when you look at your models and theories, it's really important to understand the basis of those models and theories in depth, because if you don't understand it in depth, you're not going to be able to use it to build your research questions or to collect your data. Next. So let me go into a broad area of research. And I'm going to talk about how it can be used to do a quantitative study or a qualitative study. And then I'm going to talk about the theoretical foundations that came out of this example. So the broad topic is spiritual leadership behaviors and organization performance, which could be a topic done in a business degree, it could be a topic in an EDD, or it could be a topic in terms of organization development, or it could be a topic in the PhD program. And so the broad area was, is there a relationship between spiritual leadership behaviors and organization performance? And it comes out of the broad area of research of just relating leadership to organization performance, organization conditions, and there are hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of studies in this broad area of research. So anybody guess what are likely to be the theories or the areas of theories and models that I'm going to be looking for based on that topic?
Greenleaf?
What would you use Greenleaf for?
Spiritual leadership as a servant leader.
Well, his model is servant leadership, but you're getting close. There are actually spiritual leadership models. There are a number of them. So when you're looking at a broad topic, you want to try to find a model as close to that broad topic as you can. And if you were to pull articles on spiritual leadership, you'll find some spiritual leadership models that have a religious perspective and some that don't. And so you can begin to collect those. And then at the same time, they're all different areas of organization performance. You can look at commitment, you can look at actual performance, et cetera. So there are different ones you can. So there were two resulting problem statements that came out of this. From a qualitative point of view, you could say, it is not known how various spirituality practices of an organization's leaders influences the organization's climate and performance. So the how question means you want to go in and explore it and understand it in depth. The focus is on understanding the phenomenon. On the other hand, the quantitative statement says it is not known if and to what degree, that begins to say numbers, measurement, there is a relationship between the level of, once again, numbers and measurement, spirituality practices and leadership, organization climate, and annual performance improvement. Okay, so there are three variables in that case that they're taking a look at. Spirituality, leadership practices, organization climate, and the actual improvement in the performance of the organization. Next. So there were a couple of models that were identified by this learner in terms of qualitative. The qualitative, they identified a model with 3 dimensions that they could use as a solid model. In quantitative, that model didn't have any instruments related to it. So in the quantitative side, they had to actually go find, because you have to be able to measure it, you have to collect data, right? They had to go find 3 different models. One for spiritual leadership, one for organization climate, and the last one for organization performance. And so they could then use those as their 3 variables and develop their hypotheses off of that, whereas on the qualitative side, they could use the components of the model to develop their research questions. Next slide. So here is the qualitative one, and then they could have the research questions that, what are the spiritual leadership practices of the leader in the organization? How do these practices influence the climate? And then how do the dimensions of organizational climate influence the improvement in organization performance? All right? And then on the next slide, you'll see the quantitative. And what they did there is they found the 3 different instruments with the 3 different areas. The thing about quantitative, when you're looking for the models for your theoretical foundation, you have to find instruments to collect the data. So because in quantitative, I wanted to see if there's a relationship between the level of the spiritual leadership practices and, let's say, the level of the climate in the organization. I've got to measure that, correct? That means numbers. And if I'm measuring it and collecting numerical data on it, it means I need an instrument to collect it. And that you can't just put together your own instrument for quantitative. So you have to be able to find them, because they have to be valid, reliable, and used in prior studies. So this is a case where, although they were looking at kind of the same area, because of what they were trying to do to collect the data, the one model worked very well for the qualitative, but it didn't have instruments where they could actually collect data on the quantitative. So to do the quantitative version of the study, they had to go find those instruments based on those theoretical foundation models. Okay, next. So ask yourself, as you're thinking about your dissertation, one, are you doing qualitative and quantitative? And what are the major topic areas you're looking at? Because this goes to, what is the real issue you're trying to research? What are you trying to understand? Is it the nature of some dimensions in an organization, or is it something else? Are you trying to understand, like, how do leaders create high-performing teams? That's different than looking at the relationship between the variables. But if I'm looking at leaders creating high-performing teams, I may want to look at the leadership dimensions. I may want to look at team performance dimensions. Okay, so it's really important that early on, as soon as you develop your problem statement, you start thinking about what are the theories or concepts or areas that you need to find, theories, models, and concepts to help develop your research questions and collect your data. Next. So we put together in here kind of a step-by-step approach to finding your models and theories, and a step-by-step approach to building that section. So the first thing is you have to identify those models and theories. And then you need to begin to discuss them and think about them, and how are they actually relevant to your problem statement. And I find some learners, when they do a dissertation, they come up with a problem statement, then they come up with a set of models and theories. They're not even related. Because what they haven't thought about is, I have to use these models and theories to collect the data to answer my problem statement. Because research is all about answering what? It's about answering your problem statement. And so in order to answer your problem statement, that's why you go collect data. And the theoretical foundation gives you a way to look at and think about that data. So when I look at the spirituality model, it will tell me, so what does spirituality really mean in an organization? You'll find that the model may have 3 subcomponents or 8 subcomponents, and it helps you better understand. And so you use not only that model, but you use the subcomponents of the model to collect the data, whether it's qualitative or quantitative. Next. Then you also end up discussing that framework and thinking about it in terms of how you're going to use it, why are you going to use it that way, and what is it going to do for your dissertation. That means thinking about how you're going to use it for the research questions, thinking about how you're going to use it for the data collection, and thinking about how you're going to use it later on for your data analysis. Next. I made my slides too. As I mentioned, on the quantitative side and the qualitative side, I'm going to do one at a time. On the qualitative side, the primary focus for your data collection is your research questions. So, and you saw the research questions from the qualitative study, such as, how do the spiritual leadership practices influence the nature of the climate? Okay? That's a general question, and in order to get to that, you're going to probably interview people and ask them that question about some leaders. And so in that case, you're using the model to come up with these broad research questions. You also often use the subcomponents of the model because you don't actually go, when you do the research, go ask people your research question. Your research question is not what you interview them on in a qualitative study. The research question is the broad area of knowledge you're trying to find out. So you have to come up with interview questions because you're going to have to spend an hour with them, or at least 45 minutes interviewing them, right? And if you only had 3 research questions, are you likely to be able to do an hour interview and collect meaningful data? No. So you have to, if you were doing an interview, bring that down and use it to develop the interview questions. Your theoretical foundation model and understanding the subcomponents and actually using them to build the interview questions help you collect that data. Okay, so on the qualitative side, you're going to build the research questions out of the model or models, and then you're even going to use the subcomponents in your understanding of that model to build your interview questions. On the quantitative, it's different. On the quantitative, although you put together a research question, you very quickly drill down to what are the variables you're trying to collect data on. So does spiritual leadership correlate with high performance? So you may want 40 organizations where you collect the spiritual leadership level of the leaders and you collect the level of organization performance, and you do a statistical test to correlate it to see if they are correlated. That means that you need to collect data using instruments. So you have to collect data on the level of spiritual leadership practices of those leaders, and you have to collect data on the organization performance. So you would set out these surveys to the 40 leaders to have them fill it out on their leadership practices and maybe turn in their organization performance data. So in the quantitative side, you're using those models and theories to, 1, define your variables. So the variable would be level of spiritual leadership, and it would be level of organization performance, or it could be level of organization commitment or something like that. And so you have to have an instrument generally for each one of those variables. Yes?
Are you saying that the instrument would be the survey? Because I think in chemistry, you can have a beaker, but it depends on how you hold it and what you do, it can really change.
Yeah, that's a great question. Having come out of sciences, in the social sciences, there are ways to collect data other than surveys. So, for example, I had a learner who measured, is there a difference in the way Chinese Americans and American Americans perceive trustworthiness by reading your face? So in that case, it's more of an experiment than it is using a survey. But most EDD students and most psych students don't do experiments. They do survey type research. However, you could do that type of perception studies in psych or experimental studies, and that actually don't generally use surveys. They use materials, like in the sciences. Also, if you're in education or if you're in the psych program, for example, you may want to know if virtual reality or games are the better way to teach creativity. Which is likely to lead to higher levels of creativity. And therefore, you might test creativity with something other than a survey. It could be a psychological instrument that actually gets them to do something rather than take a survey. So although I tend to talk about this in terms of surveys and data collection, if you're doing a more experimental type focused study, you might use something different. But the same thing applies. You would have to define what your variables are. So maybe you're comparing the use of virtual reality, since we can now all do virtual reality on our Samsung phones, versus, and don't laugh, that's probably one of the biggest breakthroughs in technology that we're going to see impacting education in the next 5 years, is that, and then you can actually get them free if you buy a new Samsung phone, that you can compare the virtual reality approach to learning versus the use of a game. But once again, you have to have models and theories behind games. what do games do in terms of stimulating creativity, et cetera, versus what would virtual reality. So you would still, because the nature of the learning in terms of games or virtual reality is going to be your independent variable, you still have to go find models and theories. And you still have to find a way to measure it, but it might not be an instrument. It might be some set of materials or something else. Okay? So thank you for asking the science question. Yes?
I'm writing the chapter 2, which is this one.
Right.
And I have an instrument which is a questionnaire. My chair said that write to the person who really created the questionnaire. I have been writing to them for about 6 months now, and they're not answering. What can I do? I still need to use that instrument.
You have to get permission to use the instrument. So the other way to do it is sometimes is you can approach a journal where they have written in and contact the editor in the journal and ask them to contact them. Ultimately, you're going to have to get their permission in order to use it, or have your chair contact Dr. Bailing about anything else that might be doable. But generally, that's a requirement to use an instrument. And sometimes it's easier to go find another version of the instrument than it is to get permission. Because often, depending upon what the dimension is you're measuring. Now, remember, on the quantitative side, you have to have validated instruments. On qualitative side, if you're doing interviews or questionnaires, you develop your own. You do not need to. Are you doing a quantitative study? Quantitative. Yeah, on quantitative, they have to be validated instruments used in previous research. On qualitative, they do not. Okay?
In the last 5 years, so it took me.
No, the instruments do not have to be from the last 5 years. No. Let me clarify that. Because this is a big question all the time that comes up. The articles you're using for your dissertation, 75% of them needs to be within the last 5 years on the date when you publish your dissertation, approximately, okay? However, and when you're defining the need for your study, we want to see that need justified with some recent articles as well, because if it's a need from 10 years ago, it may not be a need anymore. But your instruments, many of the instruments that are validated and reliable are 10, 15 years old. And there is nothing that prevents you from using instruments that are 10, 15 years old. They probably have a lot more validity and reliability statistics behind them. And if that's an issue with your chair, note that we discussed it here, and they can always contact either their master chair or their chair supervisor or Dr. Bailing to get that validated. Okay? Yes. Yeah, you remember one of the questions I had up there was what is the level of the spiritual behaviors, which is often something that's done in case studies. You may want to understand, because case studies, you like to have a minimum of 3, but 4 or 5 sources of data. Using quantitative surveys to put together the description of like what are the levels of the spiritual practice, or what is the nature of the climate, as well as doing the interviews, is ideal. And actually within a case study, you can even have correlations. You can use it just for descriptive statistics, that's graphs and charts, et cetera. But within a case study, you can also say, and if by the way I get enough data, I might run a correlation on the side. Because remember, a case study is really a methodology, not a design. And it can actually be, we just keep it simple and call it a design for you all. It can include qualitative and quantitative sources of data, okay? And we like to see it. A really good case study usually has, at least, I prefer to see 4 sources of data, so you can really understand that phenomenon and all the variables. Because part of a case study is to define the variables that are at play. And so collecting data on some of them is one way to do that. Let me get back to this so we can finish it up, and then we'll have questions afterwards. Okay, so next. We already talked about this next one. You want to identify your data collection approaches, and generally they're different. In the quantitative, you tend to look for validated instruments, or you want scientifically approved methods like materials and a very careful, structured process to collect data, particularly if you're doing psych experiments. On the qualitative side, you're more likely to do open questionnaires or Likert-based questionnaires to collect data, but it doesn't need to be validated because you're just trying to understand the phenomenon. But you can use valid instruments as well. And you generally have 3 or 4 different forms of data on the qualitative side. Next. I'm not going to go into these, but I'm just going to discuss them quickly, is that this framework was put together through research. You know, it's how we create new models and concepts, right? This is a new model or framework or concept, and I put it together having had dissertation students here from the beginning of the program by picking out the best practices and seeing where people struggled and how they ended up putting it together. So you will not go in and find GCU dissertations that do exactly this step by step, because we've taken the best practices and now we've created a model in theory, and now we're training everybody on it and sharing it. So you'll find people starting to use this model or theory or approach, but you may find a chair, or you may find you want to use a different approach. We're not preventing you from doing that. It just needs to be an approach that's used in research. So you're not going to find a dissertation that uses exactly these steps, but I have put some dissertations in here that illustrate these steps, illustrate the different components of the best practice, and I put in the page numbers so you can actually go look at them. Okay, so next. And so this was the influence of teacher participation in professional learning communities. And in this case, it was a case study. And the principal who was trying to do this was trying to understand how the participation of the teachers in these learning communities influenced the performance of those teachers in a number of different ways. So she did it in terms of looking at some of the concepts and putting together her theoretical foundation. So one of the concepts she needed to look at was the professional learning communities. So she collected all the models and the information so that she could use that to begin to build her research questions. She then took these different models and theories and she actually created a visualization, because you'll like to be able to take your model and concept and visualize it. And you'll see in a lot of articles when they're published, people try to purposely visualize and create models and concepts because it does a better job of communicating the information. And you'll see in some of the dissertation examples here where they actually did put that visualization, which we call the theoretical framework. It's actually the frame, it's the picturing of it, and she did that. And you will see in this particular study, she used it to actually collect the research questions. She also used it as the basis collecting performance data, and she collected performance data in the schools. She went and collected the numerical performance data to see how the PLC over a period of time, did it appear to influence and create an improvement in the performance of the school on the state tests. And she actually found it stayed flat, which then in a case study, like a lot of other research, that didn't make sense. So she went in and examined what comprised those test scores. And what she learned was that the actual expectations of performance on the state test scores went up year over year. So staying flat was actually improvement. And then she ended up doing some statistical analysis to be able to demonstrate that they actually did improve in terms of their actual test scores year over year. So the next study. In this case, it's important to think about how she put this all together. in a case study, we have a problem statement, like she wanted to understand how the PLCs were going to influence the performance in the organization. And so she broke this into a number of research, was how does the nature of the teacher participation influence the collaboration? Because the reason to have PLCs and what the models and theories say is it's because you want to collaborate. And then she said, okay, how does this collaboration then influence the actual instructional practices? Because if they have effective performing PLCs, the goal of the PLC is to put in better instructional practices. And so then she went through the next logical step and said, how do these new instructional practices actually influence student learning? And she looked for models and theories behind these, so when she developed her interview questions, she could use those models and theories to develop the interview questions. But it's important to create a logical structure when you're putting together your research questions. You just can't pull them out of your head. You have to think through what's going. You had OD classes, right, if you were in education. And I think in the psych program, there are also organizational effective classes. So you need to put together the fact that leaders make something happen, teams making something happen in terms of people interacting in different ways, and it's the interaction that causes change in the organization, and that change improves performance. So that logic has to come out in your theoretical foundation models. Next. Okay, this next study is also a case study, and this is actually a case study where there were 2 quantitative validated surveys used. In this case, the learner wanted to understand how the emotional intelligence and specific approach to coaching influence the development of emotional intelligence in gifted and talented students. So what he needed to find were models around what? What is he studying? Gifted and talented students. So he found some models on gifted and talented students. What else is he studying? Coaching. So he had to find a model on coaching, and we use situational coaching. And then he had to find a model on EQ. You got it. So he went and found those models and theories, and he actually found the instruments as well, and then he used it to create a theoretical framework and diagrammed that and drew it up, and then started thinking about what he would expect to find. And so next slide. He used those to develop a set of research questions. The first one is, what emotional behaviors and skills do teachers use in the classroom in managing the social and emotional behavior of gifted students? He could get them to tell him, right? Or he could actually use a validated survey. And he did go and use a validated survey of emotional intelligence and had those teachers complete it. And he could talk about it, because often with a number of these surveys, there are actually national standards or different types of standards for different professions. So he could talk about it, and he found that actually the teachers, in terms of comparison to other professions, had a very high level of emotional intelligence that they were demonstrating from a self-perception perspective in the classroom. Then the second question is, what coaching practices do teachers use in the classroom in managing social and emotional development behaviors? He could get that from interviewing, right? Or he might come up with an observation form, both of which would be based on that same emotional intelligence survey, but he would use those questions in a different form. And then how do they use coaching practices? He actually used a situational leadership coaching instrument, and so they completed it. And then he also looked at how did they use those to coach their students. Next. This was another case study. And you'll also notice, if you're in residency, that about 1/3 of our students do case studies. 2 good reasons to do case studies. You can do qualitative and quantitative data collection, and it's actually a great leadership skill for the future. The fact is, leaders tend to do case studies. And it gives you an in-depth understanding of something. So in this case, he was trying to understand classroom disruptions. Big issue nowadays, right, in the classroom. And he wanted to understand the nature of those classroom disruptions. You want to go to the next one? And so he found a model of classroom disruptions, and his school system actually happened to collect data on classroom disruptions. And what he really wanted to understand is, what is the difference in classroom management practices for teachers who have a lot of classroom disruptions versus teachers who have only a few? He didn't have enough teachers. He could have done that as a quantitative study with some instruments, but there weren't that many teachers in the school. So he decided to do it as a case study. He collected the disruptions for 6 months. He actually got a bimodal distribution, so he had ones with low and ones with high. And then he started exploring that. He did observations, he did interviews, he collected other data, all based on the PBIS classroom discipline model and a couple other models and theories that he used for creating his observation form. Next one. This was a quantitative, quasi-experimental study where she was looking at the development of critical thinking in dental hygienists in a particular program. And so she identified some models and theories in the concepts she was looking at. And the concepts were critical thinking, concept mapping, and reflective journaling, because she was going to use reflective journaling and concept mapping and teaching those skills and to measure the improvement in critical thinking using a psychometric instrument. So she needed models behind the critical thinking. She needed models behind the concept mapping. Those were skills she was teaching, right? But she still needed a theoretical framework because those were her independent variables. So for every one of your variables, you need to have some model or theory behind it in a quantitative study. Next one. So she put together and identified her dependent and independent variables, and the dependent variable was a level of critical thinking. She created that theoretical foundation. She then used those variables to develop her hypotheses, and then she used those models to help collect her data in terms of the critical thinking, comparing those two different models, which is why it was an experiment. All right? Next. I won't go through these. Let's go to the next study. Okay. This was, once again, a quantitative study, and he was looking at teachers' perception of the level of collaboration within mathematics PLCs and whether the higher level of collaboration would make a difference in terms of performance of the schools. So you got a whole bunch of schools within the school district, and the variables are what? What are the variables he's looking at? The what? Teachers' perception of the level of collaboration and the performance of the schools. Okay? So he collected the performance of the schools for state performance results out of the state databases, and he had the teachers fill out a collaboration survey on the perception of collaboration within the PLCs, and then looked at the difference between high-performing and low-performing schools, the causal comparative design, to see if there was a difference in the level of collaboration in those schools. So he used the models and theories to define his variables, and so whether it's a quasi-experimental design, whether it's a causal comparative design, or some of the earlier ones that we talked about were correlational designs, you have to have variables. You have to have a way to collect the data. It could be through a questionnaire or an instrument. It could be through some form of other forms of methods of collecting data used in experiments. Next. Let's go through the next. Okay. So, writing the theoretical foundation, given what we talked about, the first thing is, when you write your theoretical foundation, it follows the background to the problem section, which is where you define the need or the gap, and you created your problem statement out of that. You want to remind your reader, every one of the sections in your dissertation, you want to remind the reader of the context. That's why at the beginning of every chapter there's an introduction. When people go and read a dissertation, do you read it from page 1 to page 300? No. So in this section, you want to remind the reader of the need or the gap that you're filling. Then you're going to identify and discuss the various laws, theories, models, or concepts you need for the theoretical foundation, either relating it to the variables in your study, relating it to the phenomenon that you're trying to study and understand, like how do PLCs influence instructional practices and performance. So you're tying your theoretical foundation to your problem statement because it has to come out of it and be aligned to it. It can't come out of the air. It's like when you do your problem statement out of the need, the theoretical foundation follows and has to be linked to it. You are then going to identify the specific models, theories, and laws that you're going to use, and you're going to describe them. You're going to describe them in terms of what they are, how they've been used in research, what the components of them are. You're going to describe them in depth, not a one-paragraph description. You have to demonstrate you are an expert in that model, those series of models and theories, because when you graduate with a doctorate, the difference from a master's degree, you are now a world-class expert in your topic, which means you're a world-class expert in your models and theories. Okay. Then you're going to, you want to go to the next slide. Then you are going to discuss how you're going to actually use those to develop your variables and hypotheses or your research questions. And then finally, you're also going to discuss those in terms of how you're going to use it to collect your data. So kind of the process that we went through, begin with your need, identify the models and theories, make sure you understand them, describe what they really are, and then describe how you're going to use them to build your research questions or your variables and hypotheses. That's all the theoretical foundation section is. It becomes very important because it actually comes back in Chapter 5. Chapter 5 is kind of the meeting, the summary of all your findings and a discussion of so what. Well, one of the so whats is how did the data you collect contribute to the defined need, right? You defined a need, you collect the data. Well, in Chapter 5, you now go back and say, here's how my data contributed to the defined need or gap in the research. The other thing you discuss in Chapter 5 is, how did the data I collect add or contribute to the models and theories? And when I say contribute, it can be a number of different ways. It could be, did they further validate the model or theory? Did they demonstrate it in the context of studying the phenomenon? Did it in some way add? For example, is this the first study that looked at these two variables together and now it's demonstrated that this model or theory is related to this model or theory? Did it contradict? You know, maybe what was expected didn't show up and you can say, can't prove it since this is only one study, but it appears that maybe this model or theory doesn't apply in this type of organization. And then in terms of addition, also, you know, maybe you were using a particular model and it had 3 components to understand why students leave school, but then your interviews found a 4th. Well, you could say it appears there may be a 4th component that may fit well into this model that should be further researched. So in Chapter 5, you then come back and you talk about your data. How did my data contribute to the defined need that I said is the reason I was collecting it, right? How did my data contribute to the models and theories? And then you also add in, how did my data make a contribution practically? You know, is it going to help leaders to do this? Or is it going to help teachers to do this? Is it going to help cultural attachés do this? How is it going to contribute from a practical point of view? And then you also say, from a societal point of view, you know, how's it going to contribute to the society? How's it going to contribute to the community? And so that's why it's important to clearly define the need, find the right theories and models, collect the data using them, because you can't talk about how you contributed to the defined need, and you can't talk about how you contributed to the models and theories unless your data actually came out of your problem statement and addressed it, and your data came out of it and was related to some models and theories. So that's pretty much the end of this. There are a set of references in here. There's a video that's referenced. It's a cool YouTube video where it's about 10, 15 minutes long, where a professor at a university goes through and visually creates the visual framework of all the variables, dependent, independent, mediating, moderating, and shows how to create it visually. And there's some articles in here on how to visualize a theoretical framework or how to create a framework. So there's a set of about 4 or 5, including an article on theories and information from what I call real sciences, the hard sciences. So they should be useful resources to you.